All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects. This is the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, nature experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for bearing with us with our technical difficulties. I'm Deb Markowitz, TNC State Director for Massachusetts, and we're so lucky today to be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Parrish. He's the Nature Conservancy's Global Managing Director for one of our very top priorities, protecting oceans, lands, and water. Jeff is responsible for TNC's vision, ambition, and direction on efforts around the world to protect terrestrial, freshwater, and marine biodiversity. He's TNC's organizational champion for protected areas, and he works with communities and Indigenous people to enhance protection, management, resilience, and durability of these important natural places as our planet gets warmer and more crowded. Previously, Jeff was the director for the Patagonia Parks Permanence Project, and he served as vice president for conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Network. Today, Jeff will share with us TNC's global strategy for protecting habitat, and he'll discuss how innovative financing, authentic partnership, and collaboration contribute to the success of this work. After his presentation, Jeff will answer your questions live. As you think of questions for Jeff, please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again so much for joining today. So Jeff, please take it away. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Deb. I hope, can everyone hear me okay? And the presentation is up?
It's looking great.
All right, super. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. It's such an honor to be with all of you today, and thanks for taking some time, your lunch hour, to be with us. I am extremely humbled to be back in this role at the Nature Conservancy, and I say back because I'm what we call a boomeranger at the Nature Conservancy. I began my career here at TNC back in 1996 as the Latin American ornithologist, which for a bird biologist was a pretty sweet gig. And I actually began my career with TNC even before that. For you see, I was working with species like this, the red-eyed vireo, which is certainly a hemispheric citizen, to, let me just make sure this is advancing. And I was working in a place not far from some of you on the Nature Conservancy's Clayhead Preserve on the northern tip of Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island. And it was there that I got to watch the pulse of migration coursing through the veins of the planet and to study it and to see really what was at stake and how we were losing coastal habitats. I had an extraordinary time then, but since then the birds have not. We've lost about 30% of songbirds since when I was doing this research. And in fact, that crisis is mirrored around the world by species and our climate alike. I don't need to fill your head with more grim details about the climate crisis. We are certainly seeing today everything that we talked about and more just even 10 years ago. And we're facing a biodiversity crisis as well. As much as we talk about the climate crisis, there's a biodiversity crisis going on. If you look at some of the most reliable data to look around the world at what's happening to biodiversity, one of the best indices is the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. And they put this out every 4 years, and it gives us an index of how are things going. And basically what it tells us when it comes to biodiversity is that since 1970, we've lost 68% of wildlife. Since 1970. 1970 was the year I was born. This is happening on our watch. It's happening during our generation. And it's really up to us to be able to solve this problem. And so TNC has done extraordinary work around the US and around the world for decades. And we've done many things that help both people and nature. Today, given this biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, we're doubling down on two priorities, and you'll be hearing more about this over the coming years. Under our new leadership, we are focused on climate mitigation and adaptation using nature as that solution. And nature, in fact, can solve about a third of the problem that we face when it comes to the climate crisis. And focusing in on healthy oceans, freshwater, and lands. And a huge part of that is, in fact, protection. So the same work that we began with back in the 50s is more vital today than ever before. Protection alone will not achieve each of these goals. As I said, nature is part of the solution for climate, not everything. We have to have strong agriculture and production practices as well as protection to have healthy oceans, freshwater, and lands. But protection alone won't achieve that. But there is no way we will ever achieve either one of these goals without focusing and doubling down on protection work. And that's where we are today at TNC, a renewed emphasis on our protection work at home here in the United States and abroad. As many of you know, we started our organization as a group of scientists who were concerned about a 60-acre stand of hemlock, and in fact went out and said, we need to protect this from development. And so for the exorbitant price of $7,500, we purchased that land, and it today remains in the Mianus River Gorge in New York. It remains a TNC preserve, and it has endured. And so protection has been at the core from our very beginning and is embedded in our DNA. But today in 2020, protection looks entirely different. So a few ways that it looks different, and the ways that we've innovated, the ways that we've modernized, are expanding that definition of what protection. It's not just a national park or a state park. It is actually includes other types of land management, such as communal conservancies, where communities come together to own and steward their natural resources and are empowered to do so. It includes indigenous lands. It includes the lands on Department of Defense properties. So there's a broader definition of protection. And it includes our work to avoid conversion of critical lands as well. So we have to widen our aperture when we think about protection in this day and age. Oops. We skipped forward. My apologies, everyone. Not quite sure how that happened. Here we go. So today, my apologies. Today as well, our protection work looks very different. It's not just about protecting biodiversity, but it's about the merging of our biodiversity and climate strategies. We have to do that to save biodiversity, which today is on the move as things move northward and in the northern hemisphere in latitude and up in altitude. And so we have to think about prioritizing not just where biodiversity, freshwater, terrestrial, and marine biodiversity is today, but where will it be 50 years from now? And so our cutting edge science has actually shown us a new roadmap to where we must invest to ensure that we have biodiversity in a warmer, more crowded world. Probably most important, the way that our protection work looks different in 2020 is this focus on our authentic partnerships with Indigenous people and local communities. Nature, we can no longer have people be a part from nature, but people are a part of nature. And so we are committed as the organization, both in our values and in our strategies, to having long-term authentic partnerships that empower Indigenous peoples and local communities and let their voice, choice, and actions move forward to protect biodiversity. Indigenous lands alone on the planet today make up about 28% of all the landmass on the globe, and they make up more than a third of the important biodiversity areas that TNC has identified, and about that same percent of the critical carbon reserves left in nature. They have been stewarding our lands, waters, and our air for millennia, and we are intent on our authentic partnerships with them. We're using that science that tells us where biodiversity is and where living carbon reserves are to help us identify critical places and where to use your support best. This is a screenshot from a new data viewer that we have that's brought some of the most cutting edge science to play to help us think about where we engage and how our strategies will be contributing to our big outcomes on climate mitigation and adaptation and on healthy oceans, lands, and waters. And importantly here, we're not just mapping biodiversity, we're also looking at where is the carbon, the densest carbon in nature, and carbon that we absolutely cannot let escape into the atmosphere. And so we're using that science to conserve a representative and resilient, effectively managed and durable network of protected areas worldwide. And while I was putting this presentation together last night, I didn't anticipate some conversations I'd have this morning, which were about the United States joining the Convention on Biological Diversity under the new administration and committing to 30 by 30% of our country protected by 2030. So TNC is poised to support that vision and make sure that we achieve protection success. But what does success look like when we talk about protection? It's not just bucks and acres, although we all get excited when a new park is declared or a new acquisition occurs. It certainly sends thrills up our spine and makes us feel excited about the future of the planet. But we're not done by just establishing a protected area. We have to make sure that they are representative and resilient. Those areas are protecting all biodiversity, both terrestrial, freshwater, and marine alike, equally, that those areas can endure a changing climate. So choosing the right places and in a comprehensive way is critical. They have to be effectively managed. And this is the day-to-day, roll up your sleeves, hard work of stewarding these natural resources, ensuring that they are managed for long-term success, and that they have the right actions and investment that make certain that we can achieve the outcomes we want to see for nature. And perhaps the hardest piece of all is making sure that that protection work is durable, that it lasts, and that it's permanent, and that it can't be reversed by a political decision or by an economic downturn. And this is absolutely critical. And today, as we are faced with a COVID economic crisis, where people like our partners on Indigenous lands are struggling, people who were benefiting from nature because of tourism dollars are struggling. And so we need to make sure that we have that sustainable finance, strong policies, and the commitment of local people to ensure that conservation is enduring. And you're going to see and hear more about that from the Nature Conservancy in this decade. This comes home to New England and to Massachusetts as we look in places like the Berkshires, which are absolutely critical to the future of biodiversity in the Appalachians and in the Eastern US. This linkage, this connection amongst habitats and amongst altitudes and across latitudes is absolutely vital to protect not only the biodiversity that's in Southern New England today, but where it will be in the future. So how are we going to do this? These are big, bold ideas and big commitments. But how does the Nature Conservancy do this on the ground? So I want to give you 3 examples. There are as many approaches to achieving protection results as there are staff in the Nature Conservancy. We're constantly innovating and pushing the envelope on how can we go about doing this. But I'm going to give you 3 examples, starting first with that strategy of authentic partnerships with Indigenous people. We are working with First Nations, for example, in the Emerald Edge, which is the incredible temperate rainforest from British Columbia down into the state of Washington. And instead of buying up land ourselves, we have an innovative strategy where we are purchasing timber rights from companies in conjunction with First Nations and returning those lands to the territorial rights holders of those First Nations and giving them the tools and financial support so that they can sustainably manage and protect the lands as they so desire. I will say, one thing that is important for everyone to know is that these partnerships require long-term commitment. And that's what I mean when I talk about authentic, that we are not just in for a win and then we move on. These are long-term authentic partnerships. Come hell or high water, come difficult times such as during COVID. And in fact, we have a special emergency relief fund that we've established for our Indigenous partners during this time of COVID and the financial downturn. There are no people traveling to go to an ecotourism lodge that's run by a local community or an Indigenous group. And yet they have been stewarding these lands on the world's behalf. We owe it to them to give them support. So if you're interested, please do contact Deb or myself, and we can give you that opportunity to contribute. Another story is around an unexpected place. Some people don't know where we're working, and that is in Eastern Europe. To be part of the EU, a country has to meet some very, very bold climate goals. And so there's a rush to be able to do that using renewable energies. Well, renewable energies are not just solar or wind, which work in some places and not in others. It's also hydropower. But as it turns out, some of the richest biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity in Europe is actually in the Balkans, in the Balkan countries. So how do we meet those climate demands without compromising freshwater biodiversity through dams? TNC has been using its science to identify where dams can move in, where alternative renewable energies such as geothermal or solar could be used so as not to impact these dams. And more importantly, turning around and ensuring we have protection, community-led and nationally led protection of those rivers that we've just avoided the conversion of. And so this is really exciting because the wild and scenic river approach that many of you are familiar with in the United States is being adapted to the Balkan context. And we're excited to be doing that in more places all around the world. Today, this work in the Balkans is actually one of our flagship freshwater watersheds where we are achieving durable freshwater protection. And we'll be teaching many of us around the world, including in the United States, how to do this in this warmer, more crowded world. We're also innovating on protection through carbon finance. Many of you know that while everyone is charging forward to meet their own climate goals as a company or as an individual, there's only so much that we can do immediately in terms of changing our carbon footprints. One thing we can do is to purchase carbon credits that support protection, management, and restoration projects around the world that are going to help ensure that CO2 stays in nature and is actually pulled out of the air. One of those that's super exciting is not just in tropical rainforests, what people usually think, but also on our coasts. And so we're innovating the idea of blue carbon. Some of the densest carbon on the planet is actually in mangrove forest and in peatlands on the coast. And if we can monetize that and have investors support keeping that carbon in the ground and avoiding its conversion, that presents not only extraordinary opportunities for accelerating our protection work, having those benefits and some of that payment go to the communities that are stewarding those coastal lands and waters, but also in creating resilience under climate change. Those are the same habitats that are protecting communities and urban areas alike because of the buffering that they provide from the increasing storms because of climate change. So this is a win-win. We're pushing this envelope and exploring how people can invest in blue carbon. So those are three different strategies. What does it look like when it comes down into one place, and what does ultimate success look like in one place? And I thought I'd share an example from a place that's near and dear to my heart. And I was back in the day involved in helping to establish this new country program, which is one of our greatest successes. And that is in Mongolia, where we have a focus on desert, mountain, but particularly temperate grasslands, which are some of the most threatened habitats on the planet, the least protected and most converted. And so in Mongolia, we began with our science, identifying not only where we needed protected areas, but also where we did not want to see mining and where mining could happen because it was and continues to be a vital part of the Mongolian economy at this stage. And so using our science and this approach to mitigate that impact and offset and make sure that there are resources flowing to the places that need to be protected once we've avoided mining conversion was paramount at the time and continues to be an important part of our strategy. But protected areas, as I said, these national parks alone won't achieve the success. It was up to the local herders to manage those grasslands at a scale that was far bigger than any national park or system of national parks could be. So supporting local communities to be empowered to actually manage their grasslands and improve their livelihoods, such as through tourism or through certain local products, was absolutely vital to expanding the protection footprint and making sure that people benefited and were supportive of conservation for the long term. And finally, even during a time where most countries are facing extraordinary debt, in fact, Mongolia has reached out to us to work on a debt conversion during this time of COVID, where we could refinance their debt and in exchange for more commitments on conservation and more financial support. We have to figure out ways where we can sustainably finance and ensure that long-term durability that I spoke of. And so we are today working on new protections and improved management across the entire system of Mongolia in a very complex deal with the government that would increase their commitments to conservation and long-term sustainable finance while we support their transition to that over time. And so we're excited, and you'll be hearing more about this over the coming year, about this innovative conservation finance that can ensure that Mongolia, the people of Mongolia and the biodiversity of Mongolia have the resources they need in the long term. And innovative conservation finance and innovative deals is what we continue to do. And I thought maybe I would end with an example that is not only important, but incredibly urgent and timely. Some of you have perhaps visited the Yucatan Peninsula and Belize itself, but this entire area is called the Maya Forest, or the Selva Maya. And it is the largest tropical rainforest in the Western Hemisphere outside of the Amazon. Fortunately, there are a number of protected areas that are already in existence, but this forest extends well north of those protected areas and further to the east and south as well. There are important lands that are absolute linchpins to maintain the integrity of the Selva Maya. It's a global biodiversity hotspot that has all 5 cat species in high abundance, including about 52 jaguars at last count in this particular area that we're working now to try to protect. So this spot that you see circled is actually just to the south of a piece of land that TNC helped to protect back in 1993. In fact, a little personal story, when I came onto the Nature Conservancy in 1996, the first trip I ever took on behalf of TNC for work was to go to the area that is the green area, which ironically is shaped somewhat like Massachusetts, just above that red parcel. That is what we call the Rio Bravo Conservation Management Area. And it's a place that was protected through the generosity and philanthropy of TNC supporters and through carbon revenue, and is maintained over the long term through carbon revenue. But that didn't mean that all the other threats disappeared around that place. Just recently, we've learned about the sale of 260,000 acres immediately adjacent to Rio Bravo Conservation Management Area. The combined total of these lands makes up 9% of Belize's landmass. 9%, just in those two, the existing acquisition and the one that we're proposing now. So that 260,000 acres would not only protect a lot of biodiversity there, it would be the linchpin to actually ensure we have the connectivity and the protection necessary at scale for the Selva Maya. So we are after this right now, and we are going, and this shows TNC's commitment to protection at scale and with agility. I say agility because this picture is not hyperbolic. It's not taken from Google. This is the picture from the southern edge of the parcels that we're trying to acquire. This is on the southern edge. This is that southern boundary. This is the agriculture, the slash and burn agricultural conversion that's happening throughout Belize, outside of these protected areas, be they public or private. This is what's at stake. And this forest will not survive if we can't protect it by the proposed closing date, which is December 31st of 2020. In fact, if there are competitive bidders by the agricultural community that is looking to continue this movement northward. So we have a $6 million gap on a big deal, and it would be excited to be able to work with anyone in any amount, large or small, to be able to protect this place for those jaguars, for those birds, and for the future of Belizeans. So I want to just end with those examples and say that none of this could be done without you. We're grateful for your support. We're grateful for your commitment. We're grateful for your generosity, and you help to be the fuel that keeps us going through good times and through thin times and thick. And so we're super grateful for everything that you do for us. And I'm super appreciative of you spending your afternoon with me. Thank you very much. And I look forward to answering some questions and having a dialogue.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for that presentation. I think everyone watching would agree that if we were actually in person, we would all be giving you a standing ovation right now. How incredible. One of the things I love about this presentation is how this is really the magic of TNC. This is what TNC brings to the world of conservation, this global science that helps us really focus on the top priorities to do projects on the ground that will make a really permanent and enduring difference. So, it's so great to hear about TNC's global strategy for protecting habitat and how it touches down in places like Belize, Mongolia, and then, of course, right here in Massachusetts. You really stimulated a lot of conversation. And again, I'm sorry I'm not on video. It's just whatever. But luckily, Jeffrey is on video, so that's terrific. We have lots of questions that have come in, and I'm going to try to get to all of them. I'm going to do my best. There was a really interesting question from Mark Day. He asked, please, could you reflect on the balance you'll make in TNC's strategy between conserving high biodiversity areas versus restoring and connecting habitats as we're entering into the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration and the linked biodiversity and climate crises? I thought that was really good. Not sorry to start you with a tough one, though.
No, that's a great one. And it's actually one that we talk about a lot and within the protection community within TNC. Restoration is something that TNC is really good at and is also critically important, particularly when an ecosystem target or a species population or an ecosystem simply doesn't have enough to be able to be viable in the long term, even if we protect what's left. And so restoration is absolutely critical, and management is of that biodiversity in a warmer, more crowded world is absolutely critical. So it's a vital part of our protection work. However, it is also important to recognize that, and this is not hyperbole either, we're in the first year of the last decade we have left to protect what's left. Let me just repeat that. We're in the first year of the last decade. It is going to be critical for us to protect what we can. And so we need to be really careful about the return on investment of every dollar that goes in. Is it best to position that for protection and restoration in that same area that we're working in protection? Or do we invest in large scale restoration strategies, which dollar for dollar, acre for acre are certainly more expensive than protecting what's left? So that's a constant the balance that we're seeking in any given geography. That said, when we go to a place like the Selva Maya, there will be protection efforts of the existing habitat, and working in restoration work for the remaining areas that need to be connected is absolutely key. And so our work that we do, for example, with regenerative agriculture that helps to restore connectivity and biodiversity and the protection of soil carbon in agricultural landscapes is also vital. So not to be wishy-washy, but the answer is yes, it's important. We will balance that, but it's based on what the biodiversity needs in those critical landscapes and seascapes.
That's great. And so bringing the next question a little closer to home, are the same strategies we use to protect habitat here in Massachusetts relevant to other parts of the world? And can we scale what we learn locally to make global impact?
100%.
I like that question.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things, for example, I talked about this Rio Bravo or Belize Maya Forest deal, and that the acumen that we have to execute a complex private transaction and to be able to manage that land and to set up essentially a land trust in Belize that can manage that land all comes from our experience in the US. And Massachusetts has been, and New England has been at the core of how we think about and create and work with land trusts, how we do private transactions and acquisitions. But there are also other areas too, like freshwater biodiversity. And freshwater, how do we protect rivers, remove obstacles and dams? How do we restore environmental flows? Those are also are important to scale up in New England, which holds an incredible amount of biodiversity in the Appalachians, an incredible amount of carbon, an incredible amount of freshwater biodiversity, but also export those lessons learned and those resources outside of the US too. And so I mentioned in the case of freshwater, the Balkans are now a hotbed of our innovation, and we'll be importing some of that knowledge as well back into the US. So increasingly TNC is looking at not US versus global. We're thinking about our work as one conservancy and moving resources around to address priorities within Massachusetts, within New England, within the United States, and globally as needed. So we're really working as one global organization, moving that knowledge and resource around.
That is great. And that's something that excites me so much about TNC. And I'm a new director of Massachusetts chapter. And that's what really excited me about coming in, is we're part of this global community that's really innovating. Yep. So there's a question about nature and its contribution to solving the climate crisis. And the question is, does the calculation that nature can solve 30% of the climate crisis include the burning of forests that can be expected to be caused by increased heating and drought? And, that's a really good question. Like when we're developing this science, are we taking into account these other natural processes that are going to put carbon back into the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say that, we talked about the blurring of biodiversity and carbon and climate. That's in our science through that map I showed you with the resilient connected network, as well as how we think about using nature and nature conservation as a solution for climate. There are three ways that we think about those natural climate solutions. That's a term that's hopefully you'll be hearing more of. I know that the Biden administration is really seizing that term. It's a term that TNC created back in 2017. Those are solutions that use nature to solve the climate crisis, natural climate solutions. And there are three pathways, three ways that nature helps to do that and that we can help nature solve that climate crisis. Protection, as we discussed, and so avoiding conversion. And that would mean, for example, in Belize, keeping that imminent threat from happening and sending that carbon up into the atmosphere out of those trees and pine savannas. There is also management, which is really about what you're getting at. For example, all the forests here, I'm speaking to you from Colorado. We've had our worst fire season ever, our two largest fires, which almost merged into a super fire in the state's history. We're going to have to do work not just to protect forests, but to actually manage those forests, to reduce fuel loads, because while that is a natural process, it's way out of whack. We have way too much fuel. We've actually got to manage those forests. A lot of the trees have died because of climate change and an invasive beetle. And so we've got to manage those lands in a way that will actually keep more of that carbon from being emitted over time. So management is really key. And restoration is vital as well. So restoring healthy agricultural landscapes, restoring coastal wetlands, that serves as a vital way to not only address climate mitigation, keeping carbon from going into the air or taking more carbon out of the air, but also climate adaptation. So I hope that helps to describe a little bit. You're going to hear a lot more about these natural climate solutions over the coming years. And it's certainly a priority that really actually integrates all of our protection work, our providing food and water work, and our work on climate change itself.
That's great. Thank you. We got a few questions from folks asking for a link to the global mapping tool that Jeff was talking about. And we're going to be sending a follow-up out after this seminar is done and the webinar is done with a link to the webinar, but we'll also provide a link to that tool. It's actually not up publicly yet on our site. It's just being rolled out within the Conservancy. So that's coming soon.
Yeah, as soon as that's available, we will be able to share it. We are we're using it internally right now, and we're just working on some of those data permissions. So but in the meantime, I do encourage you to, for example, go see, look up Last Chance Ecosystems on our website, and you'll see some of that sort of innovative analysis that we've started to do. So Last Chance Ecosystems on our TNC website.
We actually had a question about that. One of our viewers said that, we know that these, you can take a look at these no regret sites. They're clear to us now. But it seemed to this person that there are other sites that probably need to be uncovered and investigated. What kind of time do we have for ongoing assessment and planning? Like, do we know it all already? We know where they are, or are we still learning more every day that are heading us in different directions?
It's a great question. On the terrestrial side, on land, we have a good understanding of where certain ecosystems are, their current condition, how much is protected. And so that calculus of conversion versus protection was actually used in identifying the last chance ecosystems and to help prioritize, if you will, the last of the least. We also have to look at the best of the rest. We have to look at large intact areas that are under some threat, but we still have a chance to protect them. So we're looking at that last of the least and best of the rest. Some of you who have been with the Conservancy for a long time will recognize that language, and it was right 20 years ago, and it continues to be correct. We are still exploring in a number of areas, and I'd say I would like to call out in particular marine and freshwater biodiversity. Obviously, we know a little bit better what's happening on the land that we walk around on in the air that we breathe. It's harder to know what's happening underwater. And so our scientists, I'm extremely proud of our scientists who, as we are refocusing within TNC on these two outcomes, have pioneered new data on mapping freshwater biodiversity around the world. So we can actually talk about what's the last of the least when it comes to river types. And so we're actually, this data viewer has some brand new information that we're working on publishing that is part of that exploration and underlines the fact that we still don't know everything. We have a lot to still uncover that helps us make sure that every dollar that you give to TNC is actually going to the absolute highest return on investment strategy.
Well, there was a great kind of follow-on question, which is, TNC is not everywhere in the world right now. So does this new strategy and map direct us to places primarily where we're already active, or is this going to lead us to expand into new countries, or maybe both?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes and. So we are looking right now at where we need to double down on places where we currently do have a presence. And obviously it's easier to do bigger and better things in a place where we already exist and have some infrastructure and relationships with communities to government. We will have to look at new geographies as well if we want to really make a difference on our mission. That won't be everywhere, and we'll be super smart about it. And that's not just science that informs us on that, where the carbon is and where the biodiversity is. There are a lot of enabling conditions that are critical to make sure that we're not that we're successful in the long run. I did want to say that there are also places where TNC can have an impact without ever stepping foot. And that's through really innovative partnerships. And so we're doing that with the likes of the World Wildlife Fund and the Pew Charitable Trust, because there may be places such as Guyana in the northern part of the Amazon, the northern part of Latin America, the Guianan Shield, those three countries in the Guianan Shield, where there's extraordinary carbon reserve, amazing biodiversity. There is imminent threat. And some of our partners are actually have a better presence on the ground and could actually get work done. So it could be important for us to help support them technically and heck, even financially, if those places are critical to the future, not only of biodiversity and carbon, but also to the future of humanity. So we'll be looking at partnerships as well as ways that we can amplify our impact. TNC is the world's largest environmental organization. That does not mean we can't be a good partner, and that partnering might be an even better strategy. But it's amazing what you can achieve when you don't care who gets the credit.
Absolutely. And, for folks on this call who are from Massachusetts, that is how we operate. A lot of our protection work, things that we have been the catalyst for, are done actually by local land trusts or by the Audubon or some of our other partners who use our science to make their conservation and preservation decisions. And of course, it's embedded in state policy. It's a great way to scale action. It doesn't have to be us in every landscape in Massachusetts or around the world to have our science and our footprint be really meaningful and drive the kind of change in the planet that we know has to happen. So, back to, global to local, this approach is the global approach, but it works really well locally in Massachusetts also. Speaking of more local, not quite Massachusetts local, were a couple questions about North America and how this analysis applies here in North America. For example, where do you see the greatest potential for this approach in North America as part of protecting areas critical to bird migration? Are there particular spots in North America that just kind of light up the analysis that we should be looking at for carbon storage?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thanks for the mention about bird migration. That makes me very happy. Yeah, I'm still fascinated with migrations of all types, but particularly birds. There is a vital role in North America. So even though we might be seeing some areas that pop, if you will, when you look at biodiversity through that last of the least, best of the rest lens, and you look at carbon, the work that we're doing across the United States in every state chapter is absolutely critical, and that's underlined by that map I showed, the map of movement. But that actually is the product of an incredible partnership that has been led by Mark Anderson there in Massachusetts, who has designed this resilient and connected network of protected areas. Basically taking, some of you will remember our eco-regional planning, and beginning to think about how does that shift in terms of climate change. And so that what you'll see in those maps are absolutely vital. And again, hopefully now is the moment to have that feed into the commitment by the U.S. government to protect 30% of natural landscapes and seascapes of the United States by 2030, like other countries around the world have already committed to doing. So there's a tremendous opportunity for North America for us to make a very significant contribution to achieving those representative, effective, and durable networks of protected areas here at home in the United States. So we're going to continue to do that work. We will certainly also be having both a local and a global field of view. And so, increasingly some of our state chapters are going to be thinking about, how do I allocate our resources to ensure success in a state like Massachusetts or Maine, and then also make sure that we're achieving success elsewhere. I believe a colleague of mine, Josh Roy, for example, is on the phone, and he works on river issues in Maine, but he also has been vital in encouraging wild and scenic river protection and protection for another type of migration, with fish migration elsewhere. Maine has thought about, how do we achieve our results here in our own state, but also how can we make a contribution to global priority needs? Because at the end of the day, we all live on one planet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In Massachusetts, for example, we have this innovative project with fishermen, measuring the catch using remote sensing equipment. And, we have proved the point, and it could be used around the world. You can't manage, you can only manage what you measure. And it's hard to rely on fishermen to report everything that we need to know to really understand what's happening in the ocean right now. The same way, we've got an aquaculture project working with the oyster farmers, and we're already sharing that information to change practices in places like Australia, and we're hoping to get into Indonesia as well, where there's a lot of this farming that's happening and can have a really negative environmental impact if it's not done well.
I love my Duxbury's, let me just say.
Exactly. Massachusetts, we're known for that. We got a really important question, I think, from a colleague in Mexico. So Nadia Nibla says, thanks for the webinar. Latin America is the most effective region in the world, with 94% of biodiversity loss. Mexico in particular is one of the region's countries with more natural areas protected. But even with these measures, they're still losing the battle. We're still losing the battle. What would you recommend for better environmental governance for countries like Mexico?
I think one of the most important things, this varies from country to country, right? And I think one of the most important things is for us to recognize that nature is part of our economies. Nature is part of our being able to survive the impact of climate change. And the more that countries are recognizing that their federal governments, their state governments, and local people, including Indigenous people, need to be empowered to govern and manage all of those lands and waters in a way that recognizes the value of nature is probably some of the most vital work that we could do. Now, TNC has a role in helping those governments or helping those local communities. As I mentioned, this 30 by 30 goal Up until, well, hopefully soon enough, almost every country in the world outside of the United States and a few others have signed on to the Convention on Biological Diversity and said we're going to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 in order to save the planet from the biodiversity and climate crisis. We have a role in supporting that, both in terms of helping develop plans, helping to bring the science and the tools, helping to build capacities, and also helping to get things like governance and land tenure very, very clear in order to empower Indigenous people and local communities to be able to steward their lands and to do their part. So TNC will be playing that sort of servant leadership role to countries like Mexico and helping them to achieve their goals for nature and people.
That's really great. I found it really interesting when you, in your presentation, talked about just how vital our partnerships are with Indigenous communities in particular, who who are on the landscapes that we're really looking at as being so critical for protection. We did get a question about it's the question about this. It was, what fraction of Indigenous partner needs are we able to meet with the Emergency Relief Fund? I know we've got emergency. I don't know much about this fund.
Yeah, we'll be happy to send you a link to it. The short answer is this fund is important. It can't address all the needs, and in fact, we're and that is why you hear so much about green recovery and about countries thinking about how do they, just as we're talking about fiscal packages to support COVID and during COVID and COVID recovery here in the United States, other governments are doing that as well, and we're hoping to and working to influence those so that it can make an even bigger contribution. But there are emergencies that are out there, particularly with partners that we have been working with long term in places like northern Kenya, where we've been working with communal conservancies for decades. And so we have a panel who's been really strategic about how to allocate those several $1 million that we've been working to raise into specific requests for support. So while it might be a drop in the bucket in terms of the global need, it's a significant buoy to our closest Indigenous partners who have a plan to be able to use this money strategically to get through to the other side of this pandemic and crisis.
There's a similar question that's come in that is, I think, also a really important question. So, in addition to working with Indigenous communities and local communities, there are other sectors who have interests in the landscape. And, the photo that you showed of the destruction of the forest in Belize really brought that home. Is there any conceivable leverage for us that could persuade the agricultural competitors to back off the at-risk area in Belize? I mean, and I assume Belize is just an example of what's happening really around the world. I assume this is true in Indonesia and other landscapes as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, that's why I mentioned that protection alone will not solve all of these problems. But protection is vital, and we'll never achieve those goals without our protection strategies. So in a place like Belize or the Brazilian Amazon, the state of Pará, for example, we will pursue protection strategies. Let's take the example of the Amazon and the state of Pará in Brazil. We will pursue protection strategies with Indigenous peoples and there, but we also have to stop that agricultural frontier and slow that expansion. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to ensure that we actually have better production, and we have certain from the bottom up, we have better production on existing lands and aren't just moving from patch to patch to patch after depleted. And so we have an incredible team under our Provide Food and Water Sustainably team, led by Michael Doan, that is working with from the corporate sector to the local level and encouraging better agricultural practices that are actually not just do no harm, but to do good. We just had a conversation about that this morning at 7 a.m. And so we would be pursuing those strategies alongside our work with Indigenous peoples and establishing Indigenous protected areas in Brazil in order to both slow the threat and also ensure the long-term protection. So it's absolutely vital. And it's important to work not just at the local level, but all the way up through the entire system through the way that government set policies for agricultural expansion to the corporate level in terms of large companies valuing the benefit. And that's what our conversation was this morning, was that the data that show that companies actually, the benefit that they get from doing not just no harm, but doing good in their sustainability practices. And so, and then having that trickle down to that very patch of forest outside of the Belize Maya forest tracts that we're working to protect.
Thank you. So listen, we've got time for only one more question. So I just want to thank everybody who's sent in their questions. I hope we've gotten to most of them, but not quite all of them. The final question is, what can people watching do to help?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for continuing your support to the Nature Conservancy and our partners. You know, we all need to do our part when it comes to the climate crisis. But I think when it comes to some of these big levers that we need to pull for climate, the big solutions on protecting nature for both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, we need your continued support. And we need you to spread the word to your friends. We need to continue to see that philanthropic support come in to support vital projects, both the important but also the urgent that we spoke about today. And do what many of you did, which is to also vote and keep your voice loud for the environment. No matter the party, it's important that the environment, as it has become part of our conversation on the political stage, climate matters now. We need to remind people that biodiversity matters, our elected officials. And so please continue to participate in that way on the public stage, but also please continue your philanthropic support to TNC in any way that you can.
That's really wonderful. You know, as we approach the end of our time today, Jeff, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with? And can you also let folks know how to find you and follow your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can follow me. We'll send this out to everyone, either in the chat. Perhaps my colleague Cynthia could do that in terms of finding me or getting in touch. But also, you know, I guess what I would say is that you know, these are tough times, and I woke up this morning thinking about how much I would have loved to have been on a plane and been there with you and visiting with many of you and talking about this. Not just from the waist up on a Zoom call. So it's been hard. I actually came back to TNC at the top of this pandemic. I've not traveled for TNC one time since I've returned, which is for someone who loves places like Mongolia and Massachusetts and Maine and California and the Borneo. That's been hard. I was heartened, however, through the fact that we had this conversation today about the United States government potentially joining the Convention on Biological Diversity and committing to 30 by 30. That 30 by 30 mantra is something that leading governments around the world have been flying that flag, and we've been there to support them. But to have that conversation starting to happen now, that it's part of the future investments of the U.S. government, both at home and abroad, is incredibly heartening. So while we hear about vaccines, this was a bit of the vaccine for my soul to hear about those positive steps forward. And it couldn't come at you know, it's coming at exactly the right time. We don't have any more time to lose. I just want to leave everyone with that urgency that we do have, that this is happening on our watch. You know, we can't do incremental contributions in both philanthropically and technically from a conservation standpoint, if we wait for someone else, the next generation, to figure this out. So we have to move now, and we're just grateful to have you and to be on this journey with you. So
that's just a wonderful way to finish your presentation. I have to say, Jeff, you know, I am so thrilled to hear about this work. It's bold, it's innovative, it's ambitious, as one of our attendees put in the chat. It's all true. And the problem is urgent, and it's huge. And it's exciting to know that we're out there every day working towards the solution, you know, with so much going on that's giving us anxiety and stress. It's just so fabulous to know that TNC is out in the world really addressing the most important issue of our time, climate change, biodiversity, and we're thinking about it at this global scale using the best scientific minds in the world. So thank you for your contribution. Thank you for this really wonderful, stimulating webinar. I know folks have really appreciated it. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in for joining us today, and also for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of the webinar if you want to share it with folks. And it'll be a video recording so folks can see the fabulous photos and graphs. If you're enjoying these webinars, please share them with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. Join us November 19th at noon for a conversation with Eric Fisher. He's the chief meteorologist at WBZ TV. Eric says all the best science and research that we have indicate the globe is warming and that humans are the main driver. Surprise, surprise. He'll discuss climate trends, the relationship between weather and climate, and the changes we've seen in Boston and New England weather and what they mean. I think he does a great job. He's going to be really interesting. He knows how to talk about science in English, which is always a help. You can find the latest webinar schedule and registration links at nature.org/MA webinars. And I want to thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.